Greetings, academic proletariat, and welcome to this rendition of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson. Today we will be discussing Period 2 in a review way and in hopes of getting you ready for your Period 1-2 exam or just a nice little review before the AP test in May. So without further ado, here we go. Just want to remind you that there's a note sheet to accompany this video. It can be found on our Schoology page in the review folder. If you don't have access to that Schoology page, or you just can't find it because you don't have a pulse, well then you send me an email and I'll send it right over because I do have a pulse. Okay, so just like we got started with Period 1, I want to go ahead and have you take a moment, think of the bookends for Period 2, which are 1607 and 1754. So you go ahead and think about those dates. Take about 10 seconds. I'll be back. While you're filling out those bookend dates, I just want to put in a quick ad. I want to remind you that reading is good. So if you get bored, or if your eyes hurt from staring at your computer screen or your iPad screen playing Clash of Clans, if you want to be smart, read the book. Okay, so let's talk about these bookend dates. 1607, obviously you remember from the Period 1 review video, that's when Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement, was established in Virginia. 1754, any takers? Any takers? That's right, 1754, the beginning of the French and Indian War, which will sort of begin our Period 3 discussion after we take our test. All right, so Period 2 has two key concepts. Key Concept 2.1, Europeans developed a variety of colonization and migration patterns influenced by different imperial goals, cultures, and the varied North American environments where they settled. And they competed with each other and American Indians for resources. If that's not a run-on sentence, I really don't know what is. So, to run on to Key Concept 2.2, let's do it. The British colonies participated in political, social, cultural, and economic exchanges with Great Britain that encouraged both stronger bonds with Britain and resistance to Britain's control. Okay, we'll look more deeply at those in just a second. So let's go. Key Concept 2.1. Europeans developed a variety of colonization and migration patterns influenced by different imperial goals, cultures, and the varied North American environments where they settled, and they competed with each other and American Indians for resources. Go ahead and take a moment to write Key Concept 2.1 in your own words. That should say 2. It doesn't, but it should. So go ahead and write down Key Concept 2.1 in your own words. There, I fixed it. Okay, hopefully you wrote down something like European settlement patterns differed depending on where they settled, but that they always pretty much made the natives angry wherever they ended up. Okay, so to get this show on the road, we're going to talk about Key Concept 2.1, Roman numeral 1, which says Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonizers had different economic and imperial goals involving land and labor that shaped the social and political development of their colonies as well as their relationships with native populations. So this means a couple things: mercantilism and other stuff. We're just going to go ahead and focus on mercantilism, though. And to get that show on the road, I'm going to go ahead and have you watch a clip from a crash course video with John Green. John, take it away.
And believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor. So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually...
Okay, so John did a good job of talking about that. God, I love you, John Green. Okay, so to get this rolling here, mercantilism is an economic theory that states that the mother country should control all trade and seek a favorable balance of that trade. So in order to do that, you need colonies, because those colonies bring you raw materials that you can then turn into manufactured goods. You need strict laws and tariffs. For example, the Navigation Acts, which were passed by Britain in 1660, these required British colonies to send all trade through Britain and not buy from other countries or other colonies, and weren't really followed. But we'll get back to those in period 3, so you just hang on to your hats regarding those Navigation Acts. And then finally, you needed things like monopolies, like big companies, to sort of facilitate this trade and to oversee it. Okay, so now, because the different European countries valued mercantilism, they all sort of search for their own stake in the New World. So we're going to go ahead and get started with New Spain. New Spain was located, as is evidenced by the sort of reddish spot on the map on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, in the North American Southwest and Middle America. We're not concerned with South America in this because this is American history. North America, that is. Okay, New Spain's mission was to achieve wealth, and sort of as a byproduct of that, Catholic conversions. They wanted to gain that wealth through silver and gold extraction, but later relied on the encomienda systems in areas like this, where there is no gold. They had terrible relations with the natives because the natives didn't like to be converted, as was evidenced by the Pueblo Revolt, a significant event in the history of New Spain, which saw the Pueblo people rise up against the Spanish and had a short-lived period of independence. The Spanish, however, came back, but they agreed to not convert any more of the natives to Catholicism, which was a big deal because it sort of shows the Spanish relinquishing the reins a little bit. Okay, to move on over, we'll go to New France, au revoir, and I think that means goodbye, but we'll bonjour or something like that. Okay, so New France was located along the Mississippi River and also in northeastern Canada. It's indicated by blue on this map here. Its mission was to achieve wealth. It did so through fur trading with the natives, and since it was trading so often with the natives, their trade relations were great. Far superior than that of the English and the Spanish. In fact, they oftentimes intermarried with one another and lived among one another. That's something that's important to keep in mind, especially if you're ever writing an essay or answering questions about New France on tests. It's usually what the College Board wants you to know. Now, the significant event in French colonial history is the French and Indian War, which starts off period 3, so we won't get bogged down with that now. Now, moving along, we'll talk about Britain. And Britain gets its own Roman numeral in Key Concept 2.1. It says, in the 17th century, early British colonies developed along the Atlantic coast with regional differences that reflected various environmental, economic, cultural, and demographic factors. So, in other words, colonial England developed into different colonial regions. New England, the Chesapeake, the Southern, and then the Middle, which I forgot there, but we'll talk about it anyways. Okay, so we'll start with the Chesapeake because they were first chronologically. Their main settlement was Jamestown, founded in 1607. It's the first permanent one, which makes it famous. Its purpose was to make money by finding gold, but you should remember that they found no gold, forgot to plant food, and a lot of them died. However, eventually tobacco is introduced, so their main economic output becomes tobacco cultivation. which is a very big deal in Maryland and Virginia, and then eventually it's going to spread into North Carolina. Their religion is Anglican, however, that's sort of secondary to their making money initiatives. Their demographics include a lot of men at first. They forget to bring girls with them because they don't really see the value in reproduction. They just want, big, hardy workers, because apparently women don't know how to work or something like that. I'm not sure. But eventually, once they rely on tobacco cultivation as their method of economic money gain, they turn to indentured servants at first because England does have this sort of surplus of labor. However, once that does not work out, as evidenced by Bacon's Rebellion, they turn to African slaves. Now, they were governed by the House of Burgesses, which was created in 1619. It's a sort of local self-government in Virginia. That'll be something that's important in a second, just to keep in mind. And then their crisis or turning point is most definitely Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in 1676, saw Bacon, sort of this wealthy aristocratic guy who just happens to befriend a lot of indentured servants, rise up and revolt against the governor, run him out of town for a day until Bacon dies, and then the governor is able to reassert power. However, it shows a significant problem with indentured servants as a labor force and marks the turn toward African slavery. Now let's venture north to New England, where the main settlement was Plymouth, started up in 1628. There was also... Plymouth was started in 1620, when the Mayflower sailed, so you can just ignore that right there. My bad. The purpose was to establish religious freedom, as evidenced by the famous City on a Hill speech. Their economic output was mostly subsistence farming. They did deal in lumber, they did build ships, they did things like that, but as you can tell by the map, people lived in houses which sometimes had farms attached to the back of them. However, there was common or communal farmland that the town sort of shared. They were Puritans. Some pilgrims intermixed, but mostly Puritans. If you recall, Puritans are a super conservative form of Protestant that wanted to purify the Anglican Church. Mostly families immigrated to New England, and the families that did live there lived for a long time, mostly because the colder climate allowed for less disease to thrive in New England. They were governed by a theocracy, which was embodied by town hall meetings in which only full churchgoers were able to participate. They have several crises and several turning points, so just to highlight three of them: the Glorious Revolution was actually an event that occurred in England. However, it brings to end the Dominion of New England, which had been a method of King Charles II to exert power on King Charles II and King James II to exert power on New England. It essentially fails. However, the Glorious Revolution sets up the Religious Toleration Act of 1690, which forces Puritans to accept other religions, and this sort of scares them. And this sort of religious crisis culminates in the Salem witch trials, which sees sort of a religious fanaticism pushed to the brink, and then finally, not related to religion but more related to land and the natives, was King Philip's War. All three of these things mark a downturn in Puritan power and signal that their whole city on a hill goal, epic failure. Okay, so now to move a little bit south from there and talk about the Middle Colonies. The Middle Colonies is evidenced by the picture here. Even though they are situated in the middle, they are not like symmetrically in the middle of the 13 colonies. So that's not something to, it's important to remember. Their main settlement was New York, initially New Amsterdam, settled in 1626, then becomes New York when the English take it over. Their purpose was religious freedom and to make money. Neither one more than the other. The Quakers wanted religious freedom, but they also opened up Pennsylvania to a lot of people to settle, because more settlers meant more tax revenue. People who settled in New York along the Hudson River made a lot of money. So religious freedom and money, neither one necessarily more so than the other. Their economic output was grain farming, trade, and manufacturing, which was evidenced mostly by their big cities. Philadelphia, the biggest one in colonial England. their religions varied because if you recall anything about the middle colonies is that they were a very diverse population. So there were Quakers, there were Anglicans, there were Catholics. They were from Germany, they were from France, they were from England, they were from the Netherlands, they were from all over the place. So it was very, very diverse, both with regard to background and religion. Its government varied. In Pennsylvania, you sort of had William Penn was the governor, however, more self-governments in the other colonies. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know that there's a crisis worth mentioning. All right, now let's move to more chaotic places, like the South. Still chaotic, if you ask me. All right, anyways, so the main settlement in the South was Charleston, and I sort of just picked a coastal town. Charleston was the biggest one. It was in colonial South Carolina. The purpose of the southern colonies was to make money. Make no mistake about it. They wanted to get rich, and they wanted to get rich fast. Their economic output was cash crops. They did so by they had these cash crops organized into plantations where they grew rice and indigo. No cotton yet, kids. Keep your mouths closed. Okay, their religion was Anglican. There was a small number of planter families that served as the aristocracy. However, they sat atop a large number of African slaves who did all the work. They governed via self-government. However, that planter aristocracy was really the ones who had all the say. And their crisis, or their turning point, is the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739, which saw slaves in South Carolina revolt against their masters. This indicated a problem with importing African slaves and marks a turn towards more reproduction of slaves, and then it also leads to more harsh slave codes that said the slaves couldn't read and write, they couldn't go out on Sundays, they couldn't grow their own food, and really turned slavery into the recognizable form that we all learned about in elementary school. Okay, so now to talk about key concept 2.1, Roman numeral 3, competition over resources between European rivals and American Indians encouraged industry and trade and led to conflict in the Americas. In other words, the natives and the English hated each other. There's no other way to really say it. Okay, at first they might have gotten along because each side needed each other and depended on each other for trade. Each side traded what the other traded for what the other had in surplus. So the English were willing to give up manufactured goods, things like guns, for things the natives had in surplus, like food and like natural resources. All right, but the way that the English live sort of had a put a strain on the native way of life. So, for example, this emphasis on trade and this cutthroat trading saw Native Americans shift in alliances, but also change the way that they lived. So men were out hunting a lot more often, which changed the way of life in Native households. And then finally, the big one, the key one, the one to remember as we go throughout this class is that the English had this hunger for land, which and they weren't going to let anything stop them. And this will be something that we see as a continuity throughout American history. And the natives sort of got in the way. And so what do you do when the natives get in the way if you're a white person of European descent? Well, you shoot them. And that's exactly what happened in King Philip's War, one of the most destructive conflicts proportionally in American history. Okay, so now to move on to key concept 2.2, the British colonies participated in political, social, cultural, and economic exchanges with Britain that encouraged both stronger bonds with Britain and resistance to Britain's control. Go ahead and take a minute, rewrite key concept 2.2 in your own words. I'll be back in a second. Okay, hopefully you pinpointed something like the fact that the colonies did things to make Britain happy and to make them angry. Both of those things happen, as is sort of going to happen in a mercantilist system. So let's see how they did that. Key concept 2.2, Roman numeral 1, says that transatlantic commercial, religious, philosophical, and political exchanges led residents of the British colonies to evolve in their political and cultural attitudes as they became increasingly tied to Britain and one another. So basically, actions taken by Britain and its colonies caused changes in colonial ideologies. And those colonial ideologies, in some cases, led to stronger ties with Britain, in some cases led to separation. And that separation obviously is going to be increased as this class continues. So let's talk about it. One way that the colonies sort of separated from Britain were through the self-governments. Initially, Britain was pretty lax with its attitude towards the colonies. It just wanted them to make money, and as long as it was making money, it really didn't care what it did for government. So in the Chesapeake, we see the House of Burgesses, which was a self-governing body. In New England, we saw town meetings, which is a self-governing body. And in the southern colonies, we saw planter rule, which was a self-governing body. And really, if you ever heard the saying, if you give a mouse a cookie, it's going to want a glass of milk, if you give a colonist self-government, it's going to want to govern itself. That saying is copyrighted, so don't think that you can steal it. However, you can remember it and use it however you see necessary. And then those pesky navigation acts, which we talked about before, is pictured in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, which required colonists to trade only with Britain. They weren't really enforced at all. So even though Britain wanted the colonists to behave, the colonies were making so much money that Britain didn't really care. It had these rules on just sort of by default, and really it saw no issue so long as the colonists were doing what they were supposed to do, and that is to make money. Okay, so now other ideological changes, religious in the realm of religion, was the Great Awakening, which was a religious movement that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s and led to an increase in evangelism. And evangelism is the idea that a person can be saved. So they're not necessarily born destined to go to hell or heaven. So the Puritans believed in this idea of predestination, which said that when you were born, it was already decided whether you were going to go to hell or whether you were going to, if you were going to go to heaven, and the way you acted throughout your life was evidence of that. So if I was born and I acted like a moron all the time, that was evidence that I was going to go to hell and people were going to treat me bad. However, if I was a visible saint, that was evidence that I was going to go to heaven. So preachers in the Great Awakening argued that that was not the case. So people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield argued that a person could be saved. They could go through a conversion experience, not necessarily a conversion, but a salvation experience. They could be baptized in front of everybody, and that would relinquish them of their sins, and then it would lead to acceptance into heaven. Once they had that experience, though, they had to sort of follow the good works of the Lord. So this was a way that Great Awakening ministers tried to get their followers to rejoin the church. So many people had strayed away from the church and had sort of lost touch, and this was a way to get them back. So it created a conflict between new ministers or new lights, people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, who believed that people could be saved, and old lights, so those old school Puritan ministers who thought that your fate was predetermined. Now, this Great Awakening seems like it's far from politics. However, it caused people to start to question traditional authority, namely those old light ministers. Another cause of questioning traditional authority is the Enlightenment. And you should remember the Enlightenment from world history. The Enlightenment is a political or ideological movement that begins in Europe in the late early 1700s, and it argues for the use of reason and natural laws to explain the world. It sort of comes on the heels of the scientific revolution, which uses science to explain things. Now people are going to use reason. They're going to use natural laws. They're going to use, instead of explanations always being abstract, they're going to look for more physical answers. Now, this led to a huge questioning of traditional authority, namely the divine right of kings. A king can no longer just say, I'm in charge because God says so. There's a little bit more thought and critical thinking that goes into it. So even though the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment seem like they'd be opposed, the Enlightenment really was not an anti-religious movement. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers were religious. They just were against traditional religion or organized religion. Okay, both of these things, however, had a great impact on the way the colonists thought about themselves and thought about Britain. Okay. Key concept 2.2, Roman numeral 2, says, like other European empires in the Americas that participated in the Atlantic slave trade, the English colonies developed a system of slavery that reflected the specific economic, demographic, and geographic characteristics of those colonies. So in other words, English colonies had slaves too, despite what they might say. They drink their tea and they think they're all good and righteous. Yeah, they had slaves too. Okay, so now if you look at this map, you can see that there was slavery in all of the English colonies. It did not only exist in 2 or 3 of them; it was in all. It was obviously less in the northern colonies. However, they did have them. Most slaves were concentrated, though, in the Chesapeake and southern colonies, where they were used to grow cash crops like tobacco and rice, say cotton, and get stepped on. Now, slavery really evolved in the English colonies. Like I said before, it was initially indentured servitude, which meant that a person was brought over from England on contract, usually for about 4 to 7 years they worked, and then they were given their freedom and usually a small piece of land to which they could become an independent farmer. Now, that was a problem because then they became competition to the planter class. And so that's where Bacon's Rebellion sort of highlights the issue with indentured servitude and marks a turn towards African slaves. The first African slaves were imported to the Chesapeake in 1619. Now the thought was that the slaves were better for a number of reasons. So first of all, they were less likely to run away in their new surroundings because they were less likely to assimilate. They had no idea where they were, whereas natives knew the landscape, and indentured servants might have had friends in the area. They could speak the language. Slaves were less assimilated, so they were more likely to behave. They had experience growing crops like rice. The west coast of Africa, rice grows very well. It has been growing there. It had been growing there for centuries. So when slaves are brought over, they have experience growing rice. Slaves obviously would never be granted their freedom, therefore they would never be able to get their own land, therefore they would never be able to become competition like indentured servants were. And then finally, even though slaves were expensive in the short run, indentured servants were free up front. Slaves costed money up front. They were less expensive in the long run because they don't become competition. Even though you have to feed them and house them and clothe them their entire lives, you don't necessarily have to buy their freedom or give them land. So it's important to note, slaves cost more up front, they're more expensive in the short run, but they're less expensive in the long run. Now, don't make any mistake about it. People who were slaves hated being slaves. They resisted in many ways. It's important to not forget this, because if we forget this, then we lose the idea that slaves had agency and they were able to act on their own. So let's talk about slave resistance for a second. Slaves resisted in overt or obvious ways, and they resisted in covert or less obvious ways or hidden ways. So overt resistance included things like running away or open rebellion, as was evidenced in Stono in 1739. Now, covert resistance is a more common type of resistance. This included worker slowdowns, breaking tools, forming their own cultures, marrying, learning how to read behind masters' backs, doing things to keep their culture intact, at least as much as was humanly possible. So it's important to note that these slaves resisted and the different ways in which they did that. And that brings us to the end of period 2. 7 more to go, people. 7 more to go. So, this is Mr. Olson signing off and wishing you a happy day. Peace.